Death is a subject that is simultaneously very simple and very complicated. I mean, we can easily identify when something has died, and we intuitively seem to understand what that means, but if we try to explain what it means to be dead to someone else, especially a young child, it becomes very hard. Typically children just don't seem to be able to understand. Even if you can explain it very well, kids just can't seem to wrap their head around it. They can't grasp the permanence and finality of death. So to cope with this inherent incomprehensibility, people of various cultures throughout history have developed intricate views on death and dying. And when we look at how these cultures are similar and how they're different, what we typically see is there's a lot of things that these cultures have in common, like how they define death, for example. Like many cultures see death not as the end of life, but as a transition. So it's like you're just moving on to another kind of life. It's like a reincarnation. And the quality of that next life often depends on your actions in your current life. We have this concept of karma to explain that. Western cultures like the United States and, a lot of European nations, they often see death as a transformation. And by that I mean you're not coming back to life again in any real form. It's more like you're moving to another kind of existence, something different from what we currently have. Other cultures, some other cultures equate sleep with death. So death is basically just a permanent sleep, and we die a little bit each day. So it kind of makes death seem less, troublesome. It makes it seem less upsetting. One culture in particular, Melanesia, Melanesians, they have this word mate or mate. I don't know how to pronounce that, but they have this term that refers to people who are dead or who will likely die soon. So death to them isn't just like a final state, it's a entire phase of life. And then many cultures throughout the world, it is quite common throughout the world to see cultures put value on different kinds of death. So some people can have a good death, whereas other people can have a bad death. And typically the way that works is if a person finishes their goals, if they accomplish whatever goals they set out to do before they died, then that's a good death. But if they fail to accomplish those goals before they die, then it's considered a bad death. Now, there are a lot of similarities in terms of what the concept of death is across cultures, but how we respond to death is actually quite different when you look at many cultures. Orthodox Jews, for example, just to mention a few, Orthodox Jews recite poems and will cover mirrors in their homes to, show their bereavement for the dead. In Papua New Guinea, there are in fact different phases that last for specific amounts of time where they engage in different kinds of grief behaviors. In a lot of Asian cultures, they practice ancestor worship, which basically just means they continue to communicate with their ancestors even long after they've died, and they maintain that kind of relationship with their ancestors. Another example would be Catholics. Catholics will pray for the recently deceased well-being. I'm not a Catholic, I wasn't raised Catholic, but I do know a lot of people who have. And a friend of mine once told me the basic concept of this is that when a person dies, they don't instantly get to go to the afterlife. It's kind of like a waiting line. Like think of this as like a DMV, basically. Like you're waiting in line at the DMV to get judged before you get to decide before they decide where you get to go. So if your relatives pray for you, then you will kind of get bumped up in line. It's like you get preferential treatment depending on how much, dedication your family shows. Obviously, that's not the exact explanation for this. That's just the basic gist as far as I understand it. But regardless of cultural beliefs, the act of bereavement is to bring comfort to the living. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, don't ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. In other words, the dead person doesn't care. The dead person is not going to get upset, obviously, if you fail to perform various actions. But performing those actions are going to make you feel better. It brings solace to you. It makes you feel some degree of comfort in response to the loss of this loved one. So yeah, these kinds of cultural practices can be quite different from one society to the next. And there are a lot of other interesting similarities and differences that we see in terms of their beliefs and practices, like the concept of the afterlife, for example. Cross-culturally, there's been one big thread we see common to almost all afterlives, and that is the quality of your afterlife, whether you get a good afterlife or a bad afterlife, is dependent on your actions while you were alive. So, most Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, Mormonism, a lot of these Abrahamic religions, they all have that element very strongly, that if you live a good, pious lifestyle and you show your dedication to your God, then you will get the good version of the afterlife. But if you neglect your duties and if you live a sinful life, then you will be condemned upon death. But the interesting thing about this is the oldest Abrahamic religion, Judaism, that actually doesn't have that concept in there. I'm not Jewish either, but as far as I understand it, the concept of hell was introduced with Christianity. So for Jews, everybody goes to the same afterlife regardless of your actions. And I actually heard a comedian talking about this, and he said something really funny. What he said was, he's up there on stage talking about how Jews don't believe in hell, and somebody in the audience asked a question, well, if you don't believe in hell, then why don't you go, rob and steal and kill people, and why don't you commit all these crimes if there's not going to be any consequence like that? And his response was, yes, I don't believe in hell, but I do believe in jail. We have laws to prevent people from doing these horrible things. So obviously it's just a joke, he's a comedian, but that really does illustrate how big these cultural differences can be. But besides Judaism, it is very common to see this common thread of how your actions in life will determine the quality of your afterlife. We see this in Greek religions and Roman religions. We see this in Norse religions. In fact, the word hell comes from Norse mythology. But there are some outliers. Besides Judaism, you also have Egyptians. Egyptians, they didn't really have qualities of afterlife. There was only really one kind, and that afterlife was reserved for the rich, like pharaohs, basically. You only got to go to the afterlife if you were rich and well prepared. If you weren't rich and well prepared, then you would just be reincarnated. So what you basically have is an eternal, working class. They just keep coming back as working class forever. Whereas the kings and the queens, they get to move on to another kind of existence. Doesn't seem very fair, but that's just how their culture was set up. And then another outlier would be Wiccans. Now, Wiccan is one of these minor religions. I'm not sure how much you've heard about it, but to them, the afterlife isn't really a transition to another state. It's more like a waiting room. So think of that DMV example again, except this time, instead of, waiting to get to go to one afterlife or the other, Now you're just waiting to be reincarnated. And the general idea of what this waiting room is like is not at all like a DMV. It's more like a foresty, natural area, where they can just relax and unwind and wait until they get reincarnated back into the world. So there are a lot of really interesting social and cultural differences and similarities regarding what it means to be dead and what comes next. But what I think is more interesting are the things that we can more scientifically verify. We have created legal and medical definitions for what it means to be dead. And one of the ones we use the most often is clinical death. So clinical death refers to the lack of heartbeat and respiration, whereas whole brain death is a completely different concept which refers to no spontaneous movement, no spontaneous respiration, no response to pain, no eye movement, no postural activity, no motor reflexes, a flat EEG for at least 10 minutes, no change in criteria for 24 hours, and that is actually, those criteria are actually very similar to a third kind of death, which we talk about, called the persistent vegetative state, where the person's cortical functioning ceases while brainstem activity continues. So whole brain death and persistent vegetative state, they actually, like I just mentioned, they have a lot in common. The person is basically dead at this point. They're not thinking, they're not feeling. The part of the brain that gives us our agency for emotions and thoughts and self-control and memories, all that stuff is gone at this point. Sure, the person's heart is still beating, but all the functioning systems of the brain that give us what it means to be human has died. So yeah, a beating heart is not the definition of life in that regard. But when you're dealing with somebody who has a beating heart, even though they're virtually dead, now things start to get a little tricky. What are you supposed to do in that kind of situation? That presents a very, tricky ethical dilemma. And the whole reason that we have these kinds of ethical dilemmas is because we don't really have any clear-cut definition of death that everybody can agree on. And this is where the field of bioethics steps in. Bioethics is the study of the interface between human values and technological advances in health and life sciences. And one of the main things that bioethics emphasizes is the respect for an individual's choice. So individuals should be able to decide how their life will play out and how their death will play out as well. And one of the most important and hotly debated topics in bioethics is, of course, euthanasia. Euthanasia refers to the ending of a person's life, often due to the person's wishes or a decision made by someone who has legal authority. Now, typically, euthanasia is not going to be allowed to be administered unless the individual has some kind of terminal condition, so they're going to die anyway. Or, in a manner of speaking, they already have died, like if they're in a persistent vegetative state, for example. And the way that euthanasia can be administered, well, actually, there's a couple. So it can be either active euthanasia or passive euthanasia. Active euthanasia refers to administering a treatment that is intended to kill. So if you were to, for example, give a patient a prescription for a drug that is fatal if taken. So you would give them that prescription, they would take the drug, and then they expire as a result. Then there's passive euthanasia, where you withhold a treatment that's intended to save. So if they're on life support, you could metaphorically, or in this case, quite literally, just pull the plug, and they would die as a result. Now, whether euthanasia is something that an individual is considering or not, and in what manner they want to pursue that euthanasia, this is clearly a sensitive subject. It poses a lot of moral, ethical, legal, religious, and other kinds of dilemmas, which is still under a lot of heated debate, and this is still not widely accepted. Euthanasia as a subject has been relatively well embraced in some areas, like in some European countries and some parts of the United States. Euthanasia is allowed under certain circumstances, but for the most part it's still kept largely banned or just outright illegal. But the places that do allow it typically allow it in the form of physician-assisted suicide. This is a process in which a physician will do that kind of active euthanasia I was describing. They'll provide their dying patient with a fatal dose of some medication that patient will then self-administer. And though this is illegal in most places in the United States and around the world, in 2011, polling data showed that most people supported this as an option. 70% of people said that individuals should be allowed to make this kind of decision. Only 17% said no, individuals should not be allowed to make a decision like this. Even if they're terminally ill and in a lot of pain, they said still they should not be allowed to make this kind of decision. So whether you support euthanasia, whether you support physician-assisted suicide for cases like this where the individual is lucid, like they can make decisions, they have good critical thinking skills, and they have a terminal condition and they're in a lot of pain, whether you support that or not, it's definitely a personal choice. It probably depends quite heavily on what your beliefs are about the afterlife and those other things I was describing earlier in the video. But yeah, whether you support it or not, the fact is most people in the United States do support it. And when we go towards the future, what we're likely to see is that this is going to become more widely available.